evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. That's their son.
Exactly.
And they had one son, and that's Alexei.
Exactly.
Right.
For almost a century, the fate of the Romanovs haunted history. Were they all killed in a single night, or did one or two children somehow escape? From royal palaces to a cellar in Ekaterinburg, from whispered rumors to imposters claiming lost identities, the story twisted itself into legend. For decades, speculation overshadowed facts. But DNA analysis finally solved the Romanov mystery, and it's not good. What DNA uncovered would not only solve the case, it would shatter the myths, destroy the fairy tales, and leave behind a truth far darker than imagined. The last Tsar falls. For more than 3 centuries, the Romanovs reigned as the beating heart of the Russian Empire. Their rule shaped not just the political landscape of Russia, but its very identity. Palaces rose in their name. Dynasties across Europe sought their favor. Yet by the opening years of the 20th century, the immense weight of history bore down with a crushing inevitability. Decades of war, internal unrest, and economic hardship had cracked the gilded surface of Imperial Russia, exposing festering wounds beneath. Tsar Nicholas II, a man born into unimaginable privilege but ill-prepared for the fires of revolution, found himself in an impossible position. Russia bled on the battlefields of the First World War, its people starving and embittered, its cities alive with whispers of rebellion. On the streets of Petrograd, hungry crowds became angry mobs. Soldiers, once sworn to protect the throne, laid down their arms and joined the masses. In March 1917, the unthinkable happened. Faced with overwhelming turmoil and pressure from both his government and the military, Nicholas abdicated the throne, thus ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The age of czars was over, swept aside by forces no monarch could control. In the aftermath, Nicholas became not a sovereign, but a captive, his family reduced from imperial icons to mere prisoners of the state. By his side was Alexandra, his devoted but controversial consort, whose German heritage and reliance on mystics like Rasputin had fueled public distrust. Their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the frail hemophilic heir Alexei, shared their parents' uncertain fate. The family was permitted a handful of loyal retainers, including Dr. Eugene Botkin, the steadfast family physician, Anna Demidova, Alexandra's devoted maid, Ivan Karatonov, the family cook, and Alexei Trupp, their faithful valet. Gone were the opulent halls of Alexander Palace, the glittering balls, the rituals of court. In their place was a world reduced to gray routine and ever-present anxiety, first in the relative isolation of Tobolsk, and eventually in the industrial shadows of Yekaterinburg. Here, the Romanovs became ghosts in their own land, watched over by a rotating guard of revolutionaries. The world outside raged with new ideas and the brutal logic of revolution, but inside their increasingly claustrophobic quarters, time hung suspended, days blending into nights, hopes shrinking with every passing week. They waited, not knowing whether the next knock at the door would bring rescue or doom. The night of July 17, 1918. As summer deepened in 1918, the Romanovs' world grew smaller still. The threat of advancing White Army troops, those fighting to restore the monarchy, made their Bolshevik captors anxious. For the Romanovs, life inside the walls of the Ipatiev house had become a grim limbo. The windows were painted over, blocking any view of the outside world. Even their daily walks in the garden, once a rare comfort, were curtailed. The air hung thick with foreboding. Then, in the earliest hours of July 17th, the tension snapped. Under orders from Moscow, the Ural Soviet determined that the family could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The solution would be as final as it was brutal. Around midnight, the prisoners were awakened and told they were to be relocated for their own safety. The group, Nicholas, Alexandra, their children, and the 4 remaining servants, descended into the cold, cramped basement. The walls seemed to close in on them as the room filled with Bolshevik guards. A harsh, glaring lamp illuminated the space as the executioners delivered their grim verdict. In a moment that would reverberate through history, the violence began. Nicholas, standing at the head of his family, was the first to fall. Bullets tore through the confined air, ricocheting off walls and striking indiscriminately. The room erupted into chaos, screams and shouts, the smell of gunpowder, the confusion of a massacre. Some of the bullets failed to kill, forcing the executioners to use bayonets and rifle butts to finish their grim work. The horror was absolute, and when silence finally returned to the basement, 11 people lay lifeless on the blood-slicked floor. 7 were of royal blood. 4 had followed them into exile and death out of loyalty. The murderers, however, knew their task was only half complete. Killing the Romanovs was not enough. The very memory of the dynasty had to be obliterated, their bodies concealed, their names erased from the living fabric of Russia. The plan to disappear the Romanovs into oblivion, once an unthinkable crime, had become a revolutionary necessity. Buried in secrecy, the night in Yekaterinburg had already been soaked in horror, but as dawn crept in on July 17, 1918, the air thickened with the panic of unfinished business. Inside the blood-splattered basement of the Ipatiev house, the executioners confronted a new problem: how to erase the final traces of the Romanovs. The bodies, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 devoted attendants, were bundled like grim parcels, weighted by the necessity of secrecy and the overwhelming fear of discovery. Their first solution was grim and hurried. The corpses, limp and ragged, were loaded onto a truck and driven under the cover of darkness to the 4 brothers' mine shaft, an abandoned wound in the forest outside the city. Here the killers tried to reduce the bodies not only to anonymous remains but to nothingness itself. They stripped them of identifying jewelry, doused them with sulfuric acid in a desperate attempt to obliterate flesh and bone, then shoved them one by one into the black throat of the shaft. But the plan was already unraveling. The shaft was not deep enough. As they heaved the bodies into the abyss, it became clear the pit could not hide its cargo. Arms and legs remained visible. The risk of discovery, of the Romanovs being unearthed by the advancing White Army, or by curious peasants, sent a ripple of dread through the group. The cover of secrecy was at risk of tearing. Panic, raw and electric, spread among the killers. They scrambled to undo what they had just done. One by one, the bodies were hauled back out of the mine shaft, their condition now even more degraded. The indignity deepened. In the confusion, mutilation followed. Faces were smashed, bodies hacked with rifle butts, as if violence could erase identity. Some of the corpses were even set on fire, yet the process was rushed, incomplete. The cover of night gave way to pale, anxious dawn as they dragged the battered bodies across the forest road. Time was short, nerves frayed. Finally, a new site was chosen, a shallow grave hastily dug in a clearing, obscured by underbrush. Here, 9 of the dead, Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 daughters, and the loyal retainers, were heaped together in a single mass grave, their remains doused with yet more acid and quicklime, and again covered with earth, rocks, and branches. But the bodies of the Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, later determined to be Maria, were treated differently. For reasons still debated by historians, perhaps an attempt at further obfuscation or confusion in the frenzied hours, these 2 were taken a short distance away. A separate, smaller pit was dug just 70 meters from the first, hidden beneath fallen tree limbs and tangled grass. Here, Alexei and his sister found their final secret resting place, isolated even in death from their family. When the burial party left, silence reclaimed the forest. No announcements were made, no graves were marked. The Soviet authorities released nothing to the outside world. The Romanovs had vanished into the soil and into myth, leaving behind only whispers and the faint, dreadful echo of gunfire. For decades, their fate would be wrapped in secrecy, a story told in hushes and rumors, an empire erased not just from power, but from the memory of the living, hidden beneath Russian earth. Whispers and pretenders. As the world reeled from the shocks of war and revolution, the fate of the Romanov family became a void into which rumors flowed, multiplying and mutating. The Soviet leadership kept a rigid silence. There was no admission of the murders, no graves, no photographs. Nothing to anchor the tragedy, in fact. Into this vacuum, stories rushed in like a tide. Across Europe and beyond, the question grew louder with each passing year. Had the Romanov children survived? Families, newspapers, and even entire governments became obsessed with the tantalizing prospect of escape. Telegrams buzzed with unconfirmed sightings, anonymous letters claimed knowledge, and every detail of the last days was picked over for clues. Even when reports filtered out of Russia about the massacre in Yekaterinburg, many clung to hope. Perhaps some of the children had been spirited away, their royal blood protected by loyalists, awaiting a day to reclaim the throne. This hope soon took human form. Throughout the 20th century, a parade of pretenders stepped onto the stage, each claiming to be a lost Romanov, a miracle survivor of that brutal night. The most enduring and enigmatic of these was Anna Anderson. Found in a Berlin asylum in 1920 after a failed suicide attempt, she asserted, first quietly, then with mounting conviction, that she was Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest Romanov daughter. Anna Anderson's story became an obsession. Her resemblance to Anastasia, the gaps and mysteries in her past, and her refusal to recant even under the most withering scrutiny, turned her into a figure of fascination. Court cases dragged on for decades as she battled to prove her identity and claim the remnants of the Romanov fortune. Judges, lawyers, and distant relatives all debated her story. Photographs were compared, scars examined, memories tested. Legends grew around her. The mysterious survivor who haunted the courts of Europe, half saint, half con woman, kept the myth alive. The legend of Anastasia was irresistible. Books and films transformed her into a symbol of hope, of innocence enduring the darkest storm. Her story was retold in endless variations, sometimes tragic, sometimes triumphant, always haunted by the idea that somewhere, against all odds, a Romanov had slipped through the net of revolution and death. But beneath the romance and the folklore, an uncomfortable question refused to fade. When Russian investigators finally found a mass grave outside Yekaterinburg in 1991, the remains of 9 people were recovered. Forensic examination confirmed that these were the Romanovs and their loyal attendants. Yet even this apparent closure deepened the mystery, for only 9 bodies were found, 2 were still missing. Where were the others? Could Alexei and one of his sisters have truly survived, spirited away in the chaos? Was Anna Anderson telling the truth, or merely exploiting the world's need for a happier ending? For nearly a century, the question hovered unanswered, feeding both dreams and doubts. Even in the age of science, the mystery of the Romanovs remained, so close to being solved, but always just out of reach. A hidden grave emerges. In the 1970s, a quiet discovery changed everything. A Russian geologist, Dr. Alexander Avdonin, secretly uncovered the mass grave near Ekaterinburg. Inside were 9 skeletons. For years, he kept the secret. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the grave revealed to the world. The remains were exhumed, examined, and presented as the Romanov family. But immediately, skepticism arose. The bones matched Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 daughters. The loyal staff was also identified, but Alexei and 1 daughter, either Maria or Anastasia, were missing. Without them, the case was unresolved. Could the legends of survival still hold weight? Or was science closing in? With the arrival of the 1990s came a new arsenal of scientific tools, poised to challenge myth with evidence and to bring the cold rigor of the laboratory to bear on the tangled story of the Romanov remains. DNA analysis, once a fledgling science, now burgeoning with promise, became the key that might unlock the Romanov riddle. The work began with the meticulous extraction of genetic material from the exhumed bones. Experts employed nuclear short tandem repeat (STR) markers, searching for repeating sequences in the DNA that could pinpoint familial relationships. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA sequencing offered another approach, tracing the maternal line, a crucial factor in a case defined by imperial bloodlines and disputed succession. The search for living relatives who could provide comparative samples led to Buckingham Palace. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was approached. He was, after all, a great-nephew of Tsarina Alexandra. The prince, with quiet dignity, agreed to provide a blood sample for science. His mitochondrial DNA sequence was analyzed, and the results were clear. His genetic signature matched perfectly with that found in the remains of Alexandra and her daughters. In the sterile, humming glow of the laboratory, blood and bone spoke with the certainty of science. Alexandra and her daughters had been found. But the path to certainty was not so smooth when it came to Nicholas II. Here, the geneticists stumbled on a complication that would ignite debate and controversy in the pages of scientific journals and newspapers alike. The Tsar's DNA exhibited a rare phenomenon known as mitochondrial heteroplasmy, a condition in which more than one type of mitochondrial DNA is present in a single individual. This quirk of biology muddied the waters. Doubt began to spiral, fed by conspiracy theorists and those who had always harbored suspicions about official narratives. Were these truly the Romanovs? Or, as some whispered, was the world being deceived by a convenient fiction? The science was rigorous, the evidence compelling, but the human hunger for mystery, fueled by decades of legend and heartbreak, proved more difficult to silence. And so, controversy erupted in scientific journals and the press. Were these truly the Romanovs, or was the world being deceived? Once again, the question remained. Was the Romanov mystery really finally solved? The missing children. For nearly 2 decades, the Romanov case remained a wound that would not heal. The grave discovered in the late 1970s contained 9 bodies, but 2 were unaccounted for. The missing were Tsarevich Alexei, the fragile boy for whom the dynasty's future was once pinned, and one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia. Their absence did more than leave a gap in the story. It poured gasoline on the fires of speculation that had burned ever since the night of the murders. Every whispered rumor, every supposed sighting, every pretender claiming Romanov blood was given fresh oxygen. For many, the lack of physical evidence became proof itself. Proof that the children had escaped. Proof that the Soviet version of events was a lie. Proof that history itself was unfinished. In the summer of 2007, nearly 90 years after the massacre in Ekaterinburg, hope and obsession finally converged in a patch of woodland not far from the first grave. 3 amateur archaeologists, driven more by passion than credentials, combed the forest floor just 70 meters away from the site where the rest of the family had been discovered. They uncovered bone fragments, small, scorched, and broken, as well as several teeth and shards of a skull. This was not the neat burial of the others. It was the hurried work of men desperate to hide what remained. The fragments were taken for forensic examination, their physical characteristics painstakingly catalogued. The scientists estimated that the bones belonged to a young male, aged between 12 and 15, and a female, aged between 15 and 19. The ages fit. Alexei had been just short of 14. His sister, if it was Maria or Anastasia, would have been a teenager, on the cusp of adulthood. Yet still, uncertainty lingered. Could this truly be them? Or has history played yet another cruel trick? After so many decades of speculation, the answer would come not from legends or confessions, but from the cool precision of science. The DNA verdict. With the world watching, the bone fragments were dispatched to some of the most advanced forensic laboratories available. The Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in the United States and the Institute for Legal Medicine in Innsbruck, Austria, took up the case. The challenge was enormous. The remains had suffered not only from decades underground, but from attempts by the killers to destroy them. Acid, fire, and time itself had left the DNA degraded and fragmented. But modern genetics was now capable of miracles. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down the maternal line, became the key. The scientists extracted sequences from the bone fragments and compared them to those from the first grave, as well as to known living relatives. One of the most critical comparisons was with Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose maternal lineage traced directly to Tsarina Alexandra. The sequences matched. Mitochondrial DNA showed that the female remains belonged to a daughter of Alexandra. Autosomal STR testing, which examines markers inherited from both parents, confirmed the parent-child relationships. The patterns in the genetic code left no room for doubt. The young male was a biological child of Nicholas II and Alexandra, as was the female beside him. To further narrow the identification, YSTR testing, which focuses on markers passed from father to son, was conducted on the male remains. These were then compared with a living cousin of the Romanov line, a descendant of Tsar Nicholas's brother. Again, the match was conclusive. The statistical power of the findings was overwhelming. The likelihood that the bones belonged to unrelated individuals was so infinitesimally small that it was, for all practical purposes, impossible. The probabilities were measured not in thousands or millions, but in the trillions. The conclusion was ironclad. After nearly a century of myth, the truth was delivered in the language of science. The fragments were the last two missing children of the Romanov family. The case, shrouded in darkness and rumor for so long, was not only solved, it was finally solved. Yes. And the answer was as brutal as it was final. The last hopes for a miraculous escape, the tales of secret survivals, were crushed under the weight of evidence. The shattered myth. The implications were devastating. Every romantic tale that had once carried hope across continents was obliterated by the cold finality of science. For decades, whispers of survival had filled books, films, and newspaper columns. People clung to the idea that perhaps Anastasia had fled into exile, or that Alexei had been spirited away under the cover of night. Survivors and pretenders fed the legend, weaving stories that the world was desperate to believe. But DNA evidence dismantled it all in a matter of years. There was no miraculous escape, no hidden princess living in obscurity, no heir to the Russian throne waiting to reappear. The truth was brutal and simple. The cellar in Ekaterinburg was the last chapter of the Romanov dynasty. On that July night in 1918, every member of the family, Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, alongside their loyal attendants, Dr. Botkin, Anna Demidova, Ivan Kharitonov, and Alexei Trupp, were executed without mercy. The myth was dead. What remained was a grim reality written in bone and ash. An entire dynasty was eradicated, not through exile or abdication, but by gunfire, bayonet thrusts, and hurried burial in shallow graves. The fairy tales of escape collapsed under the crushing weight of evidence. What the world had once hoped was a story of survival was instead the horror of annihilation. The Romanov mystery had been finally solved, and it was not good. The Romanov case became a landmark in forensic history. It was one of the earliest high-profile examples where mitochondrial DNA, STR markers, and Y chromosome sequencing converged to provide irrefutable answers to a century-old mystery. The same methods used to test the Romanovs now stand as standard practice in identifying disaster victims, solving cold cases, and confirming historical identities. The family's brutal fate advanced a science that today serves justice across the globe. But closure did not bring comfort. The legend had been enchanting, filled with possibility and hope, but reality was darker. The Romanovs were not hidden, not rescued, not reborn in secret lineage. They were shot, beaten, burned, and buried, their bones left in the ground until the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed truth to emerge. For generations, the world had hoped for a happy ending. Science erased that hope and replaced it with finality. The story was finally solved? Yes, but the ending is as grim as history itself. An imperial family extinguished in violence, their memory entangled in myth, and their legacy secured not by survival, but by the precision of DNA. The Romanov mystery may be solved, but does the truth bring closure or only more sorrow? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching this video with us, and catch you in the next one.